And because I noticed in some of the interdisciplinary talks that some presenters were better than others in trying to actively include an audience who isn't from their own discipline, I decided to explain some of the terms that I will be using. So that's what I will start with. And then I will lead you through 12 publications that mention or explicitly talk about Mereshkowsi, which appeared in the second half of the 20th century and the first decade of the new century. And you will see that the first of these papers have been written by scientists, mainly American and European scientists. Then we see an inclusion of Eastern sources. Eastern in that case means Russian sources. Mereshkowsi himself was Russian, so that quite enriched the picture that we got of Mereshkowsi. And then even later we have a bunch of cultural historians, or at the very beginning one cultural historian, and he then attracts more people into the discourse, and we see that a very different picture of the Mereshkowsi, the person, emerges than we had of him before as Mereshkowsi, the scientist. And then I'll offer some concluding remarks. The first term I'd like to explain is historiography. It's how we write historians. It's historians reflecting on their own craft. And historians realize that the way that we do write history changes quite a bit according to changing interests, changing social trends, changing fashions, and also access to sources can have a major impact, and we will see that in the case of Mereshkowsi. Especially in the case of the history of science and history of medicine, there's always a danger of writing the history of great men of science, and you can here see Cleo, the muse of history, having a laurel wreath on her own head, and especially historians who are trained as scientists or physicians in their first life tend to seek out heroes in their own profession. And this is something that cultural historians are trying to resolve by giving a fuller picture of the person. And I don't want to go quite as far as Arthur Schopenhauer, who pointed out that Cleo is just as infected with lies as a street whore with syphilis. I don't want to go quite as far, but I want to caution you against believing everything you read in a historical paper, just as you shouldn't believe everything you read in the newspaper or indeed a paper published in Science or Nature. The second topic I want to talk very briefly about, we heard quite a bit about endosymbiosis. It's the idea that even within cells, things can live together, and that new species or indeed new kingdoms, or as they are called today, new realms, can be formed by this kind of relationship. And according to the people who work on this, we are pretty much all endosymbionts. All the plants now have plastids that can do photosynthesis, and those used to be cyanobacteria, and all the animals have mitochondria, which used to be proteobacteria, and they very much contribute to power generation and distribution in our cells. And if we look at living beings on this planet, there's only a very small minority of beings which don't have either of these, and for these, I hear it's quite unclear if they used to have them at some point and lost them, or if they never acquired them. So it seems they would be at a tremendous selective disadvantage, especially not having mitochondria. This is Konstantin Mereshkowsi, and the way this talk's organized, I'm going to give you the information on him as it emerged from the literature. But I'm going to advance you some very basic facts about his life so that you can follow those papers easier. He's from Russia. He studied natural sciences in St. Petersburg. His father was an official with the Tsarist court in Petersburg, wanted his son to go into law, but Konstantin decided that he wanted to study science, so he took a candidate of science degree, a PhD in science, and he specialized in zoology in Petersburg in 1880. We know that he published quite a few papers, certainly more than 100, in Russian, German, French, and English. He would have known French growing up in Petersburg at the Tsarist court, and he would have learned German if he was seriously interested in biology during that era. We know that after working in Russia for some time, he went on a tour to California, to Los Angeles and Berkeley, worked there, published there, then got a post at Kazan University. Kazan was probably one of the top 3 Russian universities at that point, about 700 kilometers east of Moscow. And we know that he coined the term symbiogenesis, and that he was quite active in endosymbiosis research. And we know that in 1914 he left Russia, traveled around Europe for quite a bit, and died in Geneva in Switzerland in 1921. If you wanted to find out something about Mereshkowsi in the 1960s, your options were quite limited. If you look at any of the biographical dictionaries, he isn't in there. If you look at the Encyclopedia Britannica, he isn't in there. And even the 1970s, when the Dictionary of Scientific Biography, which was the big go-to guide for historians of science before the internet age, and even today, was published, he wasn't in there. And even in the new Dictionary of Scientific Biography, published in 2007, you won't find him. Today, of course, when you want to know about someone, you're going to Google that person and find a short Wikipedia article, and you do find Mereshkowsi there, but even today there are quite a few problems, because still some of the important historical research on him is in Russian, and even typing his name into Google can be quite complicated, because naturally his name was spelled in Cyrillic letters, and those would be transliterated in different ways into English, German, French. So you gotta find all these different variations of his name and search for those. And even in his own publications, depending on which language they appeared in, he transliterated his name differently. And finally, up to the 1960s, one of the big questions would be, why care for him? He was a reasonably well-known biologist at his time, but at least until the 1960s, nobody had been interested in his work for about 40 years, 30 or 40 years. This only very gradually changed when Lynn Margulis, at that time married to Carl Sagan and publishing under the name Lynn Sagan, published On the Origin of Mitosing Cells in 1967, which is regarded by pretty much everybody as the paper getting people interested in endosymbiosis research after this long hiatus from the 1920s to the late 60s. In this paper, she mentions Ivan Wallin, who worked on endosymbiosis research in the US in the 1920s, but she doesn't mention Mereshkowsi yet. That should only happen in 1981 in her big textbook, Symbioses in Cell Research. And in that, she mentions the people who still today, we believe, would be considered the founding fathers of endosymbiotic research. Those would be Andreas Schimper and Richard Altmann from Germany. They are about a generation earlier than Mereshkowsi. Then Mereshkowsi and Wallin and Paul Portier from France at that time, and André Kozo Polyansky from Russia, who's about a generation later than Mereshkowsi himself. And this is the one paragraph in which Mereshkowsi is first mentioned by Margulis in 1981. I'm not going to read it to you. I'm just going to point out that this reference to E.B. Wilson and his publication, The Cell in Development, the most influential is the third edition of 1928. This is what all later people pointed to. So because Wilson did mention Mereshkowsi in the 1920s when he was consolidating all the ideas about the cell in development, that's how people started to realize that he was regarded as an important figure during that time. The next step came another 10 years later in a book edited by Margulis and a colleague of hers, which was titled Symbiosis as a Source of Evolutionary Innovation. And this book, published in 1991, came out of a symposium sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation, which took place in 1989 at the, in northern Italy at a nice villa that the Rockefeller Foundation owns there. And they paid, they helped Margulis to invite about 20 people from all over the world starting to get interested in endosymbiosis research. And this can be seen as a step of acceptance for endosymbiotic theory in wider biological society. Margulis had received her PhD in the 1960s, then had worked at Boston University, and by that time, by about 1990, she was an established researcher at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and people started to be more interested in her theory. She had better experimental proof for her theory. So at that point, you start to get people more interested, and you start biologists working on endosymbiosis to start to develop a professional identity. And this professional identity included Margulis talking about the coinage of the word symbiogenesis by Mereshkowsi in a 1909 paper, and it also included her inviting the historian of biology, Jan Sepp. At that time he was in Australia, now he's in Toronto, to that conference, and he for the first time went through Mereshkowski's publications and pointed out that those three papers about the nature and origin of what today we would call bioblasts among the plants, his second paper, Theory of Two Kinds of Plasm as a basis of symbiogenesis, and his the plant considered as a complex symbiotic organism would be his three most important papers. So from that moment on, we start to see people actually reading his old papers. And this professionalization very much goes on when in 1992, Margulis gets a book by Leah Kakina, who worked at the Russian Academy of Sciences in Petersburg, published. In that book, Kakina writes about Andrei Famensin, Konstantin Mereshkowsi, and Boris Kozo-Polyansky as the three most important Russian biologists working on endosymbiosis. And very important to this book, there's an editor's introduction in which Margulis reviews the literature on the history of endosymbiotic theory, and in this she documents how people have thought about that. And if you read this essay, it's about 12 or 15 pages or so, you find her using terms like scientific revolution or thought style, which very clearly point out that she read the philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn, who had been in Berkeley at the same time as she got her PhD from there, and that she was very actively engaged in a scientific revolution in order to rehabilitate endosymbiotic theory. And I'm going to go over this rather quickly. We also learned quite a bit more about Mereshkowsi, the scientist. We find out he traveled extensively. He went to Berlin to study with Rudolf Virchow. We find out that he didn't read only Darwin, but also Spencer and Haeckel, the two very wordy theorists in evolutionism, which might explain some of the wordiness of Mereshkowsi himself. We get the first select bibliography. There's not everything in there, but his main papers are in there. We find out that he was mostly interested in diatoms and in lichens, and if you look at who was interested in endosymbiosis at that time, you find out that people working on those organisms would be much more likely to be interested in endosymbiosis at that point. The next step was a monograph by Jen Sepp, who talked more generally about the history of symbiosis, and this was the first monograph in the history of science to systematically include Mereshkowsi. And then in the late 1990s, you start people becoming more generally interested in the history of endosymbiosis. So this is a publication from Germany. This in 1999 is quite remarkable. It's a translation of Mereshkowski's 1905 paper published by two biologists in a biology journal. This happens very, very rarely, and we'll talk about Bill Martin a little later. He at that time was a postdoc and wanted to make an academic career out of endosymbiotic research in Germany. So I would argue that he also contributed to the professionalization of endobiotic research by that. Then in 2001, we get another publication, or the first publication by a Russian, or another publication by a Russian-speaking historian. And what I want to point out about this is that it appeared in as part of a symposium on recycling of scientific concepts from the scrapyard into practice. So at that point, people started to realize that endosymbiotic research, which by 2001 was reasonably well established in research and teaching at universities, had a prehistory, and people started to be interested in that. And then in 2002, we come to the second big turnover in research on Mereshkowsi, and I'm very happy that one of the authors of this paper is with us today. And what made this paper so very different is that for the first time, primary sources that could tell you something about Mereshkowski's politics and about his character were looked at. Those would be papers in Geneva, and those would be papers in Petersburg, Moscow, and Kazan in Russia. And from these papers, you learn that some of his moves weren't for career or scientific reasons, but they were because at 2 points in time there were allegations of pedophilia against him, and one of them led to him being fired from his professorship at the University of Kazan, and that actually led to him fleeing all the way to California, taking a false passport, taking a false name, and only after 4 years returning to Russia and then working there. In this, we also learned about his political activities. While he had been a leftist early in his life, later he was in league with the Tsarist secret police. He worked against Jewish colleagues of his at the University of Kazan, and even later when he was in Geneva, where he had fled after a court case had been opened against him, there are very crude anti-Semitic writings of him calling for the sterilization of the Jewish population in Eastern Europe, among other things. Also, at this point, people could know about his novel writing, and his novels are philosophical novels, rather crude philosophical novels, but in them he laid out a new philosophy of the universe and instructions to his disciples, and those instructions included sterilization of the Jews in Eastern Europe, among other things. So you can say that towards the end of his life he was quite desperate because he was exiled to Geneva, he was running out of money, and he became quite mental at that point, and then he finally killed himself under rather bizarre circumstances in Geneva in 1921. I want to go over this. This is just to point out that after 2002, another number of short biographical articles on him appeared. He is still mentioned in the introductions of science textbooks, and this is the climax up until today of work on Mereshkowsi. There's a volume published in German on Endosymbiosis. It's a 700-page book, and he's mentioned in many of the chapters. In that, there's a full biography of him in there, which looks at all the Russian sources. There's a full biography. There's something on his reception after 1945. So we can say that today, if you want to know about Mereshkowsi, you can find out about him. So I'll come to my conclusion. We see that over time a successively complex image of Konstantin Mereshkowsi emerges. We see that interests in the history of biology change pretty much along the lines of what the interests in biology change to. So at that point where endosymbiotic research becomes institutionalized and professionalized, we see a history of that emerging. And in the historiography of Mereshkowsi, we can see two milestones. The first would be the integration of the Russian perspective and Russian sources in '92, and the second one would be cultural historians looking at primary sources and exploring Mereshkowski's character and his politics. But even after the publication of this article and the year after that, a big monograph, but only published in Russian and not yet translated, you see that some of the authors do reflect his personality and his politics, but some, especially those publishing short biographical articles in science journals, actually do not do that. And I'd just like to leave you with these questions. Why and how do we or do scientists idolize their predecessors? Do we believe that his personality and his politics influence his science? In the case of Mereshkowsi, it could possibly easier be argued that they do not to a large extent. And can an idle science be separated from his personality and politics? That meaning, can we still talk about Mereshkowsi as the inventor of endosymbiosis without mentioning his crude political and personal views? And with these questions, I'd like to thank for your attention.